There are many other questions on other topics that the audience would like to hear. This is on education. Education is important to us with school-age children because it affects our property values. It is an issue for the entire town. People in Bethel do not believe they get enough funding to have quality education that they see surrounding towns get. Also, do you feel Danbury receives a fair amount from the state for education compared to other cities in Connecticut? And what would you do to improve funding for education in our towns? Ms. O'Brien.
Well, education is among the most important things that we can do for our towns, for the people in our towns, for our children, for the next generation. So absolutely it is a priority. It's probably the number one local priority. And we owe it to our kids, and frankly, if we do it right, we owe it to the state also, because those well-educated kids come in and they start businesses and they stay here and they develop great things and maybe fuel cell technology and things that we need to have our next generation stepping into, so we owe that to them. Now, unfortunately, the education cost-sharing formula is stilted toward the large cities, and this becomes a real problem. If you walk down the streets of Danbury, people say to me, I feel like I pay my fair share. And why is it that my schools aren't as, I see that schools in Hartford are putting up, or they're putting up here or there, or why isn't my education for my kids what it should be? I pay my fair share. And they see this, they feel that there's an unfairness here in this formula, and there is. That's a big problem. And we need to do something about that cost-sharing formula. And we need to be more aware of preparing this generation for the future, whether that's through charter schools, whether that's through programs between internships with high schools and employers, whatever method that takes. But we need to make this a priority. And the problem is that the money is diverted to the major cities. So how do we equalize that? And make it fair for everyone, and make it so that the woman in Bethel says, why is it that, that my education, why is it that I have to feel the way I do about and apologetic toward my kids' education? And again, if you remember, the property tax burden that we have in supporting schools is such that ultimately the taxpayer bears the brunt. So if the education cost sharing formula is not given a fair amount, it's up to the property taxpayers to make those very, very tough decisions at budget time. And it's not that they don't love their kids, they love them to death, but they can't afford to pay. And so we cut, and we cut, and we cut, and it happens all over in towns. So we've got to take a look at this. We've got to recognize that the cities are getting the lion's share. We've got to figure out some way to do it better. We owe it to our kids and to our communities.
Mr. Bartlett?
I'm on the Education Committee, and that has been a huge issue for me in terms of representing Bethel and just fighting on a local level for education in our town. We had a huge fight a couple of years ago to renovate our high school, and I'm happy to say that I led that and was a part of that, and made sure I shepherded through $7 million in state monies for our high school. I worked very hard on the education cost-sharing formula, and as I started out the evening, we increased monies to all three communities at historic levels: $3 million for Danbury, $750 for Bethel, and $330 for Reading. We protected Reading's interests and other towns' interests in terms of taking the cap off of special education, and I think that is going to be a huge help, and I look forward to continuing to work in that area, because special education costs are a real driver in terms of the cost of education overall in our communities. I'm also proud to have voted for legislation that provided more training for teachers that are teaching kids with autism and developmental disorders. I was very proud that I introduced legislation to give tax credits to those that give to education foundations, and that in the second session that made its way into law, because education foundations are in all three communities here, and they help our teachers, and they develop innovative ways to teach, and innovation and excellence in education is very important to me. I also worked on a bill that dealt with student ID tracking, so that every student in the state of Connecticut has an identifier, so that if a student from Bridgeport moves into Bethel or other, moving back and forth in communities, that we can look at it from a qualitative level from the state of Connecticut and help a school, so that with all this No Child Left Behind regulation, we had no idea what we were looking at. And we need to be able to look at that. We need to know that, in Bethel we have 20 some odd different languages that we teach, and in Danbury we have 70 some odd languages that we teach. We need to be able to look at all this stuff in a qualitative manner, and that's what I spent my time working on. So I'm very proud of my education work that I've done on the committee, and I look forward to contributing if I'm reelected on that effort.
Just a couple things. There were strides made in education, absolutely. There were a couple things that did happen in the district. Again, the city of Danbury lost $900,000 in early reading funds because the Democrats did go back and adjust any of the figures in the original budget. There was the in-school suspension, which is an unfunded mandate. I understand that doesn't kick in until next year, but that was something that particularly the town of Bethel Board of Education members had a concern about. I heard from an education member that she was surprised that another initiative couldn't be developed through in-school suspension that might have addressed the towns that have different situations with respect to the discipline, that they don't seem to have the number of discipline issues that would warrant the state coming in and determining how how suspensions of students should operate. And then again, because of Mr. Bartlett's vote not to even consider the budget proposal, the alternate budget proposal I was speaking of earlier, it was $4.3 million in possible education cost sharing that was not even considered, was not even discussed. And to my mind, that you can't be so arrogant as to not let all proposals come to the table. It doesn't mean you necessarily have to agree with all of them, but at least be in a position to say, I listened to everybody, I took everything into consideration. We can't be so arrogant as lawmakers to say, we're just not going to consider things. It just isn't worth doing. If we've got to remember, it's all worth doing as long as it's for the good of the kids, as long as it's an issue that we all are all concerned about. We've got to bring these ideas together. We've got to be independent-minded and bipartisan when it comes to making decisions in the state. And that's what I would certainly encourage as a state representative.
Thank you. Next question, Mr. Bartlett.